everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Fidma, and I'm running various initiatives here at the Middle East program. Today's discussion is a very important one, and we're delighted to have an expert panel to discuss the Iranian parliamentary elections that took place last Friday. I'm very happy to introduce Robin Wright, our moderator, who is a USIP and Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow. Robin really does not need an introduction in Washington, given her extensive expertise on foreign policy issues, but particularly on the Middle East and on Iran. Her work is highly regarded and highly respected here in Washington and globally. So without further ado, I will pass it on to you, Robin, to lead today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Is this on? I guess we don't have to press buttons. Welcome, everybody. This is going to be a very interesting discussion at a very pivotal time for Iran as it moves into a political transition with presidential elections next year, elderly supreme leader. There is a lot of change ahead, and for the first time, we have tangible indications of who may lead that transition. For those of you who don't know, I run, among other things, the Iran Primer, which is today the most comprehensive database and source of analysis on Iran, every subject, anywhere in the world, in any language. We have flyers outside. We put out a weekly newsletter you can sign up for to get anywhere from 6 to 12 new articles we run every week, and it's at iranprimer.com. On one point on that, we do not pass judgment or offer policy prescriptions. This is just data and analysis, and we do that so that other people can make smart decisions rather than emotional decisions. I'm delighted to be chairing this very important and impressive panel with three of the people I respect most on the subject of Iran. Ariane Tabatabai is an Iran specialist at the RAND Corporation and an assistant professor at Georgetown University. She previously was a nuclear security fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. She is author of the forthcoming No Conquest, No Defeat. You can follow her important analysis on Twitter at Ariane Tabatabai. Ali Vaez is the Iran project director at the Crisis Group. He was trained as a scientist and is one of the foremost experts on Iran's nuclear and missile programs. I turn to Ali for everything on Iran. Before joining the Crisis Group, he headed the Iran project at the Federation of American Scientists in Washington. His always timely analysis can be found on Twitter at Ali Vaez and on crisisgroup.org. Ken Katzman is the senior analyst on Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Persian Gulf states at the Congressional Research Service. He is a former CIA analyst and author of Warriors of Islam, Iran's Revolutionary Guards, which remains a very timely book. His regular reports on everything Iranian are must-reading. So I thought I'd offer a little bit of the data analysis to start us off in terms of who won, and to give you some numbers. The election, the 11th for parliament since the 1979 revolution, was the most rigged in Iranian history. 90 members, sitting members of parliament, almost 1/3 of the 290 seats, were disqualified from running again, even though they were deemed by the same 12-member Council of Guardians to have been qualified to run 4 years earlier. The vetting prevented reformists from fielding candidates in 230 of the 290 seats. In Tehran, 134 conservative candidates ran against 28 reformist candidates for the city's 30 seats, which is the largest single block of seats of any place. In Mashhad, which is Iran's second largest city, no reformist candidates were on the ballot. In all, more than 70 to 100 candidates were disqualified. That's almost half, but there's still a lot of candidates. 7,148 ran from 31 provinces for 290 seats. This is a dramatic transition from the early days of the revolution when there was one party, but there was so much squabbling among Iranian factions in those early days that the Islamic Republic Party disintegrated very quickly in the early 80s. Today, in contrast, Iran has 82 national parties and 34 provincial parties. On average, there were 17 candidates for every seat. And we think having two parties is tough. Needless to say, the new parliament is going to be vastly different from the last one. And let me provide a little bit of context. In 2016, a bloc of reformists, centrists, and moderate conservatives won 41% of the seats in parliament. Hardliners won 29%. Independents took 28%. But Parliament, as we all know, did very little to change the political dynamics, the economic situation, or to open up Iran socially. So their performance was one of several factors in this election. Let me give you some numbers of this election. And remember, these are tentative figures because some of it is still being sorted out, and there are at least a dozen seats that will be contested in a runoff in April. But so far, about 19, some say 20, reformists or centrists won seats, down from 121 in the 2016 election. That's only 6% of Parliament now, which is down from 41%. Conservative and hardline factions, including candidates closely aligned with the Revolutionary Guards, won 221 of the 290 seats, 76%. That's up from 29% in the last election. Again, the numbers may fluctuate a little bit as they sort out some of the count, but this is where we stand now. In other words, they tripled their presence in Parliament. The independents won 38 seats, or about 13%, which is down from 28% in 2016, but still twice as many as the reformists this time around. So the most striking thing about the election was the low turnout, 42.6%, the lowest since the 1979 revolution. But I want to offer some context here, or a bit of comparison. In U.S. midterm elections, in 2014, only 37% turned out. We actually had a lower turnout than Iran's election. In 2018, we had 50%. In presidential elections, not since 1968 has the U.S. reached 60% turnout. So let's put the turnout in context. But the regime does cite the turnout as a reflection of legitimacy, credibility, and popularity of the revolution. So the numbers are actually very important. And it tried to downplay the low turnout. The election came just days after the outbreak of the first coronavirus case in Iran, and the supreme leader blamed Iran's enemies for misinformation, disinformation, and exaggerating the threat, thus discouraging people from turning out. I will tell you that the numbers in Iran are staggering. On Monday, there were 61 reported cases. Yesterday, there were 95, and today there are 139. So it is indeed an issue. But Iran's election was also in context of protests in 2017 and 18, another round of protests in November that was the largest since the 1979 revolution, and then the shooting down of the Ukrainian aircraft, which led to a third round of protests. So there is greater dissatisfaction inside Iran than at any time since the revolution, and that was reflected in the polls. So the bottom line, which I'll open up to my panel, who've been patiently waiting, is that the next parliament is going to be vastly different in its outlook and its makeup, because principalists, who are the most committed to the rigid interpretation of revolutionary ideals and goals, will have the dominant voice. So let me begin with Ali, and then Ariane, and then Ken, to ask the basic question: how does the election impact the balance of political power inside Iran? What factions and what people are going to shape the future? What are the names that we need to watch? Ali, to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Wilson Center, and this is a really timely panel. Look, it's I want to start by saying we've seen this movie before. There is a lot of deja vu here. I know it sounds like a shift to the right, but it's a shift to the right in Iranian politics that we've seen before. In 2004, after Iran's negotiations with the three European countries, France, Britain, and Germany, basically stumbled and it became clear that it's not going anywhere. The reformists at the time were totally discredited internally. They had, more or less, they were in a similar situation. They had failed to push through domestic reforms. They had failed in their foreign policy, a lot of it due to the Bush administration's obstructionism at the time. What happened was the Guardian Council used that opportunity to basically disqualify 80 members of the parliament in 2004. In fact, this year, after some reconsideration, the final number of MPs who were disqualified, sitting MPs, was 75. So in 2004, it was higher. The incumbency rate in 2004 was 20%, which is the same right now. And what happened in 2004 was basically the parliamentary election paved the ground for the election of President Ahmadinejad in 2005. And I think it's more or less the direction in which we're moving right now. But the question is, in a country that has, at least in the past few months, has actually proven again and again that the parliament has been so neutralized and neutered that is basically irrelevant almost in Iranian politics. If you look at some of the key decisions in the past few months that the country had to deal with. For instance, the decision to triple the fuel prices back in November of 2019 that resulted in massive protest. The parliament wasn't even involved in that decision. And when they wanted to actually try to bring a bill to the floor and challenge it, an order came from the Supreme Leader's office that this is not an issue that you need to interfere in. The FATF bills that were sent to the parliament and approved by the parliament basically got stuck in other councils in the system. So it's not a surprise, given the disqualification rate, given the general sense of frustration within the society with political stagnation, with economic stagflation, the sense of hopelessness and despondency that we saw low participation rate. But the question is, why the Supreme Leader cared so much to have a pliant parliament at this stage in the Islamic Republic's history? And my own guess, and this is just a guess, is that that he probably is thinking about structural reforms. And for that reason, he needs a parliament that doesn't pose a lot of challenge to constitutional changes. This happened again in 1989 when last year of Ayatollah Khomeini's supreme leadership, he brought about constitutional reforms that bifurcated the political system and actually created two CEOs for running the Islamic Republic. And the record of the past 30 years has basically proven that's a highly problematic setup. The president is constantly fighting with the supreme leader because this rivalry basically brings to the fore the inherent contradiction in the Islamic Republic structure between divine sovereignty and popular sovereignty. And I think the supreme leader realizes that his successor probably would not have the same weight, the same control over the system, and would not be able to manage this. And so it's an inherent fault in the system that could be the cause of its undoing at a critical juncture in the history of the Islamic Republic. So my guess is he probably wants to bring about, to change the system from a presidential system into a parliamentary system, so that the president or the prime minister is not directly elected by the people. That is just a guess again. Another interesting trend that we see in this election is the militarization of Iranian politics. Currently, the debate about who should be the next Speaker of the Parliament is between two former Revolutionary Guards commanders. Ghalibaf, who was the former mayor of Tehran, and
Always use first names.
Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, just makes it more difficult, Robin. And Sadegh Mahsouli, who is from the Paidari faction, and their alliance, basically their coalition, allowed them to take over all the seats in Tehran. And now they're debating about who should be the next Speaker of Parliament. But this is quite unusual. I mean, we've seen former Revolutionary Guards people in the parliament, in the cabinet, but we've rarely seen a former Revolutionary Guards as a speaker of the parliament. And imagine if the next president is also a former Revolutionary Guards, you really see the militarization of Iranian politics. So these are interesting trends to watch to see if the coalition that was created prior, just 3 days prior to the election, will survive the initial phases of basically political jockeying when the parliament sits. But it is also connected to the question of succession. The person who brought the Paidari faction and Ghalibaf's team together, to my knowledge, is Ibrahim Raisi, the current chief of the judiciary, who is seen as a potential successor to the supreme leader. The fact that he could actually bring the conservatives together, and remember that he's also the only candidate, hardline candidate in Iran in the past 2 decades, who ran as the single representative of the camp in 2017, is quite telling about his growing influence in the system. And I think he's a person to watch for sure. I doubt he would run for president next year, but I think he is really preparing himself for succeeding Ayatollah Khamenei. Final 2 points. Impact on the presidential election. Again, as I said, if past this prelude, it means that we will also have a hardline president coming to power in 2021. But that's not a given. It really depends, I would say, on 2 key factors. One is this current incoming parliament's performance. If they actually get engaged in petty fights all the time and prove to be totally incapable of bringing about the kind of change and reforms that the people actually want, I think it would lower the stock of the conservatives, the hardliners, significantly in the run-up to the elections. And the second factor, which I would say it's even more important, is the elections in this country in November. If there is a president, US president in office that the Iranian system believes it can negotiate with, I doubt that they would go for someone who has the profile of former President Ahmadinejad. And finally, this is, I think, quite telling that the landslide victory of the hardliners came in an election in Iran that had the lowest rate of participation. But it basically suggests that the system is moving gradually towards minority rule. That out of this 42%, the 20-odd% who always come and vote are the diehard supporters of this system. And they will come to the streets and defend this regime regardless of the price. And the system will focus on making sure that it can take care of them, its own core constituency, the more pious, the poorer strata of the Iranian society. And it, I think, is coming to the conclusion of giving up on the middle class, that it basically cannot get them on board with its own vision, with the system's vision for the future of the Islamic Republic. And so you put these 2 things together, militarization of Iranian politics and the focus on the core constituents of the system. It's only bad news, I think, for Iran, for the future of the region, and for Iran's relations with the US.
We'll get to that issue a little bit later. Ariane?
Yeah, the challenge of going after Ali is that he's said everything you want to say, but much more eloquently. So I'll just add a few things to it. I largely agree that the parliament has proven to be even more of a rubber stamp than it had been in the past. But I think there's a couple of things here. One is that the delegitimization is that this particular election has showed that the gulf between the population and the regime is growing wider. And that's significant. It's playing out in the parliament, it played out in the elections, and it played out in the events that directly predated the election. So the protests of 2019, the protests that followed the crash of the downing of the airliner in early 2020, right after the killing of Soleimani, And all of those things are showing that the regime is increasingly concerned about losing credibility, losing legitimacy within the population, while at the same time trying to consolidate power, of course, and allowing the guards to consolidate their own power. So we're seeing the regime do two things at the same time that are sort of counterintuitive and I think to some degree counterproductive, which is, on the one hand, to show to the population that it is in control, that it is consolidating power, while at the same time seeing the population become increasingly upset and more question the legitimacy of the system more generally, not just the presidency, not just the supreme leader, but the system more generally as well. So adding to what Ali was saying earlier on, the guards, of course, made some gains in this election. Ghalibaf is a perfect example. He's the former mayor of Tehran, but he's also a guard, a former guard. As Ali was saying, the contenders for the next speaker are now likely to be guards, which is quite a departure from the past. But the IRGC affiliates have made quite a lot of gain. This is not new. This is something that they had started to do already under Ahmadinejad and prior to that. And the guards had really tried to make gains within different power centers within the country, within the system. The idea being that if the guards want to influence politics within Iran and only do so from the confines of the IRGC, from a branch of the Iranian armed forces, that they wouldn't have the same legitimacy that they would have if they're able to influence the course of politics, the course of decision-making from different power centers. And we're seeing them try to do that from the parliament, from the executive branch, and more generally from different important parts of the system. So this election specifically, I think, is a next step in that direction, allowing the guards to assert themselves from different power centers, and is allowing them to, going back to the succession, should the succession take place under this majlis, this parliament, it would allow them to push for their preferred candidates from, again, different power centers rather than just from a branch of the armed forces, which would be seen with more, would be seen as more dubious than it is if it's coming from different power centers. An overlapping faction that I think is noteworthy here that has also made gains that we should point to is Ahmadinejad's men. And there are mostly men. So Ahmadinejad's followers and loyalists, these are also people who have made gains, who have been trying to rehabilitate their image after essentially 7 years of a Rouhani presidency now, of a moderate presidency. Recalling that Ahmadinejad left when Iran was fairly isolated politically, economically. The Rouhani presidency and the Rouhani platform in the 2013 elections was really a negation of everything Ahmadinejad had done and everything Ahmadinejad stood for. So over the past few years, and I would say specifically since 2017, since Rouhani was reelected, there's been a push to get Ahmadinejad, and not just Ahmadinejad as a person, but Ahmadinejadism, if we want to call it that, the platform and the sort of ideas that he stood for, to come back in the public sphere, to gain traction once again. And we're seeing that pay off a little bit now with the parliamentary elections. I want to point to one specific person who might actually be familiar to many of you, which is Faridun Abbasi, who used to be the head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization. So again, someone who's a fairly well-known hardline candidate, now member of the parliament, who is an Ahmadinejad loyalist who had gone away from Iranian politics for a bit and who's now making a comeback. So those two groups, those two factions together, I think are, again, pointing to Iran going in a more right and toward the right. But the overlap between the Ahmadinejad loyalists and the IRGC affiliates, I think, is particularly interesting and tells us a lot about what may happen next. I want to stop here, but before that, I want to just point to the speaker issue. Again, Larijani is stepping down, Ali Larijani, who is a conservative, but he's actually been known to follow the system on some core decisions, including the JCPOA. He was instrumental in shielding Rouhani when the JCPOA talks were happening, when there was a lot of pushback in the Majlis against Rouhani. And so his coming in and playing a role in allowing the JCPOA to move forward, in shielding Rouhani and the negotiators from the criticism of the Majlis was really critical in allowing the JCPOA to finally to move forward and be implemented starting in 2016. So with him now stepping down and potentially being replaced by two people who are much more hardline, who may not be as willing to play ball with Rouhani, is also pretty significant in itself.
Great, thank you. Now to Ken.
Thank you very much. I am batting for the Congressional Research Service today. But as most of you know, the CRS does not have a quote-unquote position on Iran or U.S. policy toward Iran. We are purely analytical. We try to be anyway. Although I think there's a consensus that, at least we agree that Iran, for the past 41 years, it is an adversary of the United States. It may not be an enemy. There have been times of cooperation against the Islamic State and other periods, but I think there is general agreement Iran is an adversary of the United States. I would also start with this question: does the Majlis matter? I mean, the 2017 late 2017 uprising was in part because Rouhani was trying to skew the budget toward the cleric-run foundations and the IRGC, and the Majlis didn't really block it, and there was this uprising. And as we said, there was this legislation to try to conform to some of the demands of the Financial Action Task Force. The Majlis was on its way to passing. They even passed such legislation, but the Council of Guardians blocked it. And the Guardians, they screened the candidates. They screened out the reformist candidates in the election. The Council of Guardians also has the constitutional duty to make sure that any legislation passed by the Majlis, by the parliament, conforms to Islamic law and Iran's constitution. So it plays that other role, and anything the Majlis passes can be and routinely is blocked by the Council of Guardians, which is highly, highly conservative. The Majlis does, as I said, get involved in budgetary matters to some extent, making sure that the key constituencies are, the social network is spread around, that's true. But in terms of foreign policy, the Majlis really, I have not seen it amount to much. But anyway, I want to push back a little on, the election. There seems to be a narrative around town that Iran, the regime is running scared, it's on its back foot, it's on the ropes, it's nervous, and I guess I want to push back on that. I think it takes a lot of chutzpah on the part of the regime to screen out this many critical candidates in the election. You had, if you do that, you had to have anticipated that there could be a popular backlash when you did that. So I actually see the regime in having a lot of confidence right now. Yes, their economy's been damaged by U.S. sanctions. Yes, there is a lot of grumbling, a lot of grievances, but, I see the exclusions of the candidates, these widespread exclusions, as a sign actually of the regime's confidence that if there are protests, they can handle it. What I look for, and what I think we look for as political scientists in this business, is, are the security services cracking? Are there defections? Is there hand-wringing about what to do about protests? And to be honest with you, I do not see signs of that. I did not see any cracks in the IRGC, the Basij, the Ministry of Interior Forces, the law enforcement forces. I have seen no cracks in the security forces in any of these recent protest movements that have taken place. They did not roll back the fuel price increases that caused the uprising in November. Let's put it in perspective. There have been protests in Iraq and Lebanon which knocked the prime ministers of those two countries out of the box. Those prime ministers resigned because of protests. In Iran, there has not been one single resignation of even a cabinet minister on account of the November protests or the Ukraine airliner protests. So I'm sorry to say, I'm not seeing a lot of nervousness or regime dissolution or much nervousness even. And, we talk about the RGC. Thank you, Robin, for mentioning my book. It's an old book, but maybe it's still relevant, hopefully, inshallah. But the RGC, they are competing now more in the political system, moving out of the barracks, more into, political competition. They've been running for president consistently and consistently lost. And maybe they're hoping to win next year. We'll see. As for presidency, we'll see who runs. But let's be blunt. The RGC, they have, and Soleimani obviously was a key architect. They have accomplished the ability to project power anywhere in the region. They can project power anywhere in the region now, and that is not an accident. And that, I think, has given the RGC a lot of confidence, not only in the region, not only in the confrontation with the United States, but also in the political structure within Iran. They can advertise that they've done some things here. I mean, they knocked out 40% of Saudi Arabia's oil production in September. Let's not forget. They hit 19 targets with missiles that they engineered with precision that nobody in this town ever knew they had. Everybody in this town was shocked at the precision of that strike on Saudi Aramco in September. Everybody. So they have demonstrated capabilities that, I think have given them confidence even in Iranian politics going forward.
Thank you, Ken. I think one of the interesting things that you're pointing out about the IRGC is that in 2009, during the Green Movement uprising, there were barracks for the IRGC troops where the young members got up on the roof and were shouting death to the dictator and so forth. You saw much more visible opposition from within the IRGC back then versus today. So I want to look forward now and begin again with Ali. You mentioned that Raisi's not going to run for the presidency. So who do you think are the names we should watch for the presidency? Is Larijani, who's not going to run for parliament, he claims he's not going to run. Who should we be watching? And how do you think that the political future plays out over the next year during this pivotal transition, tensions with the United States? We'll go into the U.S. next, so I want to still look at the political situation. But whether it's Parliament's agenda, the regime's agenda, domestically, what do you think they're striving to do given the pressure they're feeling economically? And who are the players that are likely to emerge in the next pivotal election?
So that's as difficult a question to answer as predicting the results of the U.S. elections just 9 months away. But basically, if the constitutional reform that I talked about does not happen in the next few months, and we have a presidential election, which is again quite possible, this would be probably Ayatollah Khamenei's last president. And if you look at the previous record of his relationship with the four presidents who've basically served under him, he has had contentious relations with all of them. And he has gone for the old guard of the Islamic Republic in the form of Rouhani or Rafsanjani, and the new guard of the Islamic Republic in the form of Ahmadinejad. And all of it has been problematic. So at this stage, I think he really wants someone who he can work with. Now, if you look at the stock of the reformist or the more moderate forces of Iranian politics in this election, it became very clear that not only the system would not allow them to run, it has actually completely excluded them. But also, and by the way, it's a really interesting, striking change of fortunes. Just one statistics that I think is of interest, Ghalibaf, who got the highest number of votes in Tehran in fact got less votes than the top 5 sitting members of parliament from Tehran today. They
From the
all,
last election.
From the last election. So they all got more votes than Ghalibaf. And if you look at the rest of the conservative list that got elected from Tehran, none of them got more than 700,000 votes, whereas the first 30 of the Tehran MPs in the last election all got more than 1 million votes. So it's very telling about the change of fortune of the moderates. But I think the moderates have not just lost this election, they've lost their constituency. So in the upcoming presidential election, I don't think they have a chance to either get qualified or, if they are qualified, to actually win. You might get, again, if we have another Trump term, I think the Iranians would want to come up with someone who is as much of an unpredictable sort of, hardline character as his American counterpart. But I also think, you might get someone who's just a bureaucrat, a technocrat, someone who doesn't have a lot of ambitions but has proven during the track record of serving in the system as a capable manager. And there are people like that. If you look at some of the Supreme Leader's appointments in the past few years, like the head of some of these religious or revolutionary foundations that he appoints personally, and they're only accountable to him. Like Mr. Fattah, for instance, is one of those characters. I doubt you would see someone who is close to Ahmadinejad because, although I agree with Ariane that you see a comeback of people around Ahmadinejad, but those are actually people that at the end started distancing themselves from Ahmadinejad and his direction in Iranian politics. So I would look for mostly people. I can't rule out Larijani or some of the old guards, but someone who doesn't really is not too ambitious, doesn't pose too much challenge to the leader. And in that sense, this parliament is actually a test, because you have a group of freshman MPs that basically the Supreme Leader calls them young revolutionary politicians. They are not career politicians. They are really fresh faces. They don't have a lot of experience. And depending on their performance, some of them might actually be potential candidates. But my own expectation is somebody who's either from, again, if we have a hardline president here, from the hardliner camp in Iran with a technocratic background. If, however, there's a Democrat who's in favor of coming back to the JCPOA and engaging the Iranians, then you might get someone who's more moderate or more pragmatic. But again, I don't think we will go back to the reformist camp. I think that story is done for the foreseeable future.
Ariane?
Yeah, I mean, Larijani's either decided not to run because he wants to spend more time with family, or he's thinking about running, right? But I mean, beyond that, I think that if the comparison with the previous elections, 2004, 2005, is right, then I think that some of the more viable candidates may not actually be anyone that are currently on anybody's radar. Ahmadinejad being kind of the poster child for this. Nobody really expected him to be a viable candidate, really. He was running against Rafsanjani. Talk about old guard right there. It'll be interesting to see who manifests himself in the next couple of years, year and a half. But I think that some of the more promising candidates may be ones that we're not even thinking about right now. But in terms of what this Majlis's agenda is, I think there's the big picture issue of the succession, right? It is very likely that this Majlis will be in place when the Supreme Leader dies and is replaced. And I think part of the job will be to pave the way for the next Supreme Leader, or whatever will come next. But I think there are also short-term things that this Majlis will try to achieve, and that is more directly tied to the type of people who are now in the Majlis. So going into 2021 and the Iranian presidential elections, Rouhani, of course, can't run again. He would have completed his 2 terms of 4 years as mandated by the Iranian constitution. But somebody close to him may want to run, and I think that part of what this Majlis will try to achieve is to discredit Rouhani and therefore the moderates more generally, in order to make it much more difficult for anyone who's not a hardliner, who's not a principalist, to become a viable candidate. And I think there's a few places where that can be achieved, especially when it comes to foreign policy. The first is that the JCPOA implementation is continuing.
Let's wait for that for a minute. Anything more on the presidency?
So, I think it's going to play out in terms of foreign policy on three fronts. One is with the EU. One is with the United States, especially as we go into 2021, January 2021, and if a Democrat takes office, in which case I think the Majlis will be much more active, essentially, in trying to shape the course of the negotiations if they're resumed. And finally, I think on the Gulf Arabs, in the past, Zarif, for example, every time he tried to reach out to the Gulf Arabs, he would go back to Tehran, he would show up to the Majlis, and he would get slapped on the wrist. And I think that here, too, as Rouhani tries very hard to secure some sort of legacy, he doesn't really have a whole lot to stand behind right now. If his presidency continues as it has been, then he's really going to step down without having achieved anything in terms of foreign policy, and therefore nothing that he had really promised domestically. So I think that this Majlis will try very hard to make sure that that is still the case by the time he's ready to leave office.
One interesting point on the presidency, in many ways, being former president of Iran is one of the most dangerous jobs in Iran. At least two of Rafsanjani's children have gone to jail. I read a report the other day that indicated a third one had, which I hadn't known. Khatami is banned from appearing in public, going to public events, and being quoted in the media and traveling outside of Iran. I think even traveling inside Iran very much. Ahmadinejad had two vice presidents who were charged with corruption, and at least one of them went to jail. So, you wonder what's going to happen to Rouhani given the fact that his agenda has been largely unraveled. Ken, and then we'll turn to foreign policy, but not yet.
Just briefly, I think maybe it's because I don't know enough of these guys, but I'm looking at Raisi very carefully in terms of next year for the following reasons. Khamenei loves him. Khamenei appointed him to be the heads of the Astani Quds Razavi, the Mashhad shrine of the Imam Reza Foundation a few years ago. Very important post, controls almost the entire province's economy, that foundation. Then he appointed him to head the judiciary. Yes, he lost to Rouhani in the last presidential election. That's true. However, what these recent Majlis, last week's election showed is that the regime is perfectly willing to fix the candidate field to favor who they want. And I would say Raisi might assume that the Supreme Leader and the Guardians Council will simply fix the field to give him a free run. Khamenei went from being president of Iran to Supreme Leader. So there is precedent for an Iranian president to move up to Supreme Leader. So I still think that Raisi this is something Raisi is looking at, and my analysis is this is something the Supreme Leader is looking at as well to engineer Raisi into the presidency next year.
Before we get to the broader issue of dealing with the outside world, Aran, you made a point about this will be the Supreme Leader's last parliament.
I think we've been saying that for a number of years now, but it can be, right? It is likely that it will be. I'm not predicting when he's going to.
He's 80 or 81 in July, 80. But we don't believe he's suffering from any health issue right now. I think he's surprised everyone with how sturdy he is.
Absolutely.
81.
Okay, I just want to be clear about that because I wanted to make sure there's not something we didn't know.
His father lived to see his 105.
Yeah, there was a joke about Khomeini when he turned 86, and it was very popular. Iranians have wonderful humor, and the joke was his grandchildren asked him what he wanted for his 86th birthday, and he said he wanted a baby African gray parrot. And the grandchildren said, why? And he said, because they're supposed to live 100 years, and I want to see if it's true. So he intended to be around for another 100 years.
So just quickly, the point I think I was trying to make is that the system is
Speak in
certainly
the mic.
preparing for to lay out the groundwork for the succession, and that includes any steps that may be taken in the parliament. So I'm not trying to predict when Khamenei may die and when the succession may take place.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that. Okay, this is my last question, then I'm opening it to yours, so think through what you want to ask. Jane Harmon gets first grab. So let me ask you, let's, Parliament aside, let's take the fact that the hardline Revolutionary Guards, et cetera, have now become the dominant power. How does that affect engagement with the United States, with the outside world, on a whole range of issues, whether it's the nuclear issue, tensions with the Gulf, what happens next in the areas where Iran is projecting power, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. How does that, do they feel more empowered to be more assertive? Or is the fact that there have been protests made them rethink, recalibrate how they engage and how far they go? Again, I'll begin with Ali.
Sure. Just two more names I remembered when Ariane and Ken were speaking. Watch out for Saeed Jalili, the former nuclear negotiator, whom actually might want to run for next year's election. And boy, that would be ironic. And Jahromi, the current Minister of Communication, is a young guy, very ambitious, wants to come across as a very modern guy, but he's committed some mistakes already. I don't know if he would be a viable candidate or not. Anyways, on foreign policy, look, obviously people matter in politics, people matter in diplomacy. Now, in politics, in the parliament, there are always debates about foreign policy. I agree that the parliament does not play a major role in deciding Iran's foreign policy direction or even sort of influencing the trajectory. But it can impeach the members of the cabinet. It can put much more pressure on Foreign Minister Zarif. It can limit the maneuvering space of the government. For instance, some of the things that Zarif suggested last year as potential compromise with the U.S., for instance, ratification of the additional protocol in the parliament, I think would no longer be possible after June, after this parliament sits in. And so that's one element. Second element, the Speaker of the Parliament sits at the Supreme National Security Council when the state policies are designed and devised. And it would be quite ironic, but basically now the Rouhani administration has to deal with two of the rivals in the 2017 presidential election, and 2013 presidential election as the head of the judiciary and the head of the parliament, who sit at the Supreme National Security Council and have a vote on foreign policy directions. And as Ariane alluded to, Larijani used to be the swing vote, and in a lot of instances he actually helped the Rouhani administration. Now they've lost that vote. So it will be, again, much more difficult, and I think it would push Rouhani to become much more of a lame duck for the remainder of his term. That is the case. But does that mean that diplomacy with the U.S. is more difficult? I mean, I've heard both interpretations in the past few days. It will be easier because the system is more unified, consolidated, or it would be harder because these are hardliners. I think both interpretations are misguided because, it really depends on the situation. This is a system that has proven again and again to decide based on what it sees as expedient. In its strategic interest, right? The negotiations with the U.S. started, and there are people in this room who know it better than I do, but the secret negotiations in Oman started in 2011, when the parliament was fully controlled by the hardliners and the ultra-conservative president was in place. But if you ask former U.S. negotiators, and this is where I get to people matter in diplomacy, they say yes, but those people were impossible to deal with. And by definition, I think the U.S. and the West generally have a really hard time dealing with the Iranian hardliners. They just talk past each other. I've seen this again and again. And so even if the system really wants to engage with the West, with a hardline government and a hardline parliament, it will be much tougher, but it doesn't mean it's impossible.
Ariane?
Yeah, so, just to reiterate that foreign policy, national security policy, comes out of a unified system, right? There is bargaining that happens within the system, but ultimately when a decision on such national security issues as the nuclear file is made, it is made with the entirety of the system. Now, the push and pull that takes place helps draw the contours of that decision, but once the decision has been made, for example, to negotiate a JCPOA plus, for example, in 2021, then the parliament is going to be playing a fairly minor role. So we shouldn't overstate the importance of this particular election, of the composition of this current majlis for Iranian national security and the nuclear file and regional activities more generally. But I think there's a couple of places where the parliament and the rise of the hardliners, the rise again of the hardliners, can be significant. They can, as Ali was saying, pressure the government, and they've already started to do so. So we may see more of that type of activity. For example, over the past couple of months, there's been more of a push to force the government to withdraw from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, we don't take that very seriously because that's, again, the decision-making doesn't take place in the Majlis, it takes place elsewhere, and the Majlis is a very small part of that system that makes that decision. But nonetheless, the fact that there is more pressure to get the government to leave the JCPOA is significant. As we move forward, as the Iranians and the Europeans fail to kind of get in line on the JCPOA, as the Europeans push forward with the dispute resolution mechanism, for example, the Majlis may play a more active role in forcing the government to take more actions to violate the JCPOA, to dial down its implementation of the JCPOA. And again, these are things that we've seen a little bit of, but that may become stressed more. That may increase as we move forward and we move toward 2021 and the presidential elections. So yeah, I think that they can add the Majlis can add bumps on the road. I don't think it is the only player or even the most significant player in choosing the direction, but it can certainly play an important role in adding pressure and adding stress for the government to make sure that it doesn't achieve its goals.
Let me frame the question a little bit differently for Ken. My point was, let's push the parliament aside. Let's look at the broader political trend. You wrote about the Revolutionary Guards, which are known as the Pasdaran in Farsi. So is the Pasdaranization of Iranian politics going to change its approach to foreign policy?
Well, I think the United States policymakers need to be prepared for a very rough ride. I use this phrase in a lot of talks I give around town. These boys play rough. These boys play rough. They put 80-year-olds in jail. They take over airports and economic institutions to take economic control of these organizations. They clearly want to get revenge for Soleimani, who was the architect of Iran's regional strategy. As I said in my previous answer, they feel that the RGC largely feels they have accomplished their core national security goals, which is to be able to project so much power in so many different places in the region that no one will attack them. They can deter. They've achieved a certain measure of deterrence. I believe they want to force Mr. Trump to cave in on sanctions. I believe they will continue to push. They want to force the United States out of Iraq. They are going to continue to push. Even a few days ago, pro-Iranian proxy militia, the Nujaba movement, is still attacking the U.S. Embassy. Even today, after the killing of Soleimani, Iran's allies in Iraq are still attacking U.S. locations. They are going to keep arming their proxies and allies with short-range ballistic missiles. And interestingly, I know a lot of U.S. policy focuses on limiting Iran's longer-range ballistic missile capabilities. Iran does not project power with long-range missiles. They are projecting power with short-range ballistic missiles provided to the Houthis, to Hezbollah, to Iraqi, the Kataib Hezbollah militia in Iraq. This is how Iran projects power, not with 800-mile range missiles, but with 100-mile range missiles. And Iran, I see no evidence Iran is willing to bargain any of that away at all. So, again, I think there is a certain emboldening that's taken place from this election, and I would just circle back to, the U.S. needs to be prepared for a rough ride here.
Great, I thank you all. Jane, did you want to start with a question?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jane Harmon. I'm the president and CEO here, and I would go anywhere to any time zone, day or night, to see Robin Wright. Just want you to know, who is half a star in the Wilson Center crown. The other half is in the USIP crown, which is the only reason she's not 10 times a star at the Wilson Center crown. But she's fantastic. And for all the panelists and everyone else, I can't imagine you would disagree with me. Raise your hand if you disagree with me. Okay, that was intimidating, right? But anyway, we have a new practice at the Wilson Center where we won't have events at the same time. So our new practice hasn't worked because we have a event right now, which is why I was late, Robin, about a new book written by somebody named Ben Buchanan called The Hacker and the State. And it's brilliant, and he's very much a part of what we do as Robin is. So I apologize. I'm sorry, my sister. I'm sorry I was late. So I may have missed things, but this is information you can't get anywhere else, just the whole conversation. And, I'm so impressed about the future may not turn out the way Donald Trump thinks it will in Iran. Just thought I'd mention that. But my question is about the people of Iran. You've mentioned the protests a couple of times. The savage crackdown on the protests was apparent to all of us. And I'm thinking about the event I just was in, the hacking and the cyber capacity and the access to technology. Maybe you answered this, I apologize, but where do these protests go? I mean, what is likely to happen in the next period, whether it's 1 year to 2 or 3? Don't the people come back? Don't they understand through technology what's available in the rest of the world and what they get? And if they do, is Iran going to kill all its people in order for regime survival, or what?
Great question, and it's something we have not covered. So Ken, did you want to begin with Ken? Ali, do you want to begin with that?
Sure. And I should say I was at a simulation at the Munich Security Conference with Jane, and she played the Secretary of State, and boy, she makes an excellent Secretary of State, I have to admit. Yes, protests, look, I think an interesting phenomenon, if you look at the protests in the past 2-3 years, is that they are becoming more frequent. They are becoming more existential. They're targeting the core of the regime. They're targeting the supreme leader more and more. But do they pose an existential threat to the system? Not yet. But, I'm making this prediction with the caveat that regimes in that part of the world are stable until they're not, right? But if you take into account the fact that in the recent protests, basically the numbers, if you look at the numbers, it's been quite limited. According to surveys inside Iran, at most in all of these protests, there were about 200,000 people who came to the streets throughout the country.
Are you talking about November or?
Combined. November, January, combined 200,000 people. And the system can still mobilize millions and can bring them to the streets. It has the will and a fearsome capability to suppress, and it has actually demonstrated. I think the Trump administration actually got the wrong message from the lessons from recent protests. That the administration increasingly believes that the regime is on the brink of collapse, and it's only a question of time. Whereas if you talk to Iranian officials, they give you the exact opposite perception, that they demonstrated by killing a few hundred people in a matter of few days, by cutting off the internet entirely, which did cost their economy more than $500 million a day, that they're willing to go at any length and at any cost to remain in power. And they've demonstrated to the Trump administration that they are in full control of their internal sphere. As Ken was mentioning, they've also demonstrated their power in the region by the kind of attacks, spectacular, brazen, that they've conducted in the past few months, from the attack on Aramco to the attack on Ain al-Assad. And then in contrast, you have a society that is, primarily, I would say, the sense is political apathy, despondency. There's no viable alternative to this system inside the country or outside of the country. And the Iranian people have experienced this before of basically knowing precisely what they don't want, but not knowing what they want, which often adds chaos and turmoil to their existing misery. So I don't think they want to repeat that experience. I don't think they still want radical change, but the short-sightedness of the system is, in Iran, that this was actually an opportune moment for them to bring about a government of unity, to open up internally. But because these people came to power, these are still the Jacobins of the 1979 revolution, they came to power at the time that Shah demonstrated a little bit of weakness, and the revolutionaries basically sensed blood and they went for it. And so they're very reluctant to compromise under pressure, internally or externally.
Ariane?
Yeah, so, earlier Ken said something to the effect of this is a regime that is currently pretty confident. But I think that there is, we should distinguish something. The regime, I think, is fairly confident in its ability to control the situation. So I agree with everything that's been said so far, that I don't see the regime collapsing immediately, though, again, as Ali was saying, these things tend to happen when they happen, and if you look back at the sort of assessments prior to the revolution of where Iran was going, most people thought that it was fairly stable, including President Carter, who said as much in Tehran, actually, in what would be the last visit by a U.S. president to Iran. So yeah, I think the regime feels confident in its ability to control the situation. It's been doing so by controlling the flow of information. It's been doing so by cracking down very heavily in the November protests. But I think that it doesn't actually feel very confident in its legitimacy. You don't have to kill hundreds, disrupt the flow of information, shut down the internet, and disqualify 7,000 plus candidates if you feel like you're legitimate and that the population is on board with your values, with your policies and what you're pursuing. I think that is also tied to several things. One is that the population is increasingly, as Ali was mentioning, there is political apathy. There is a lack of viable alternatives, whether it's within Iran or outside of Iran. I suspect we'll come back to this in a bit. But all of these things are pushing the regime to feel like it is not losing control, but at the same time in realizing that it actually does lack the legitimacy that it so wishes to have within the population.
Did you want to weigh in on this, or shall we?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think I agree generally with what's been said, but I think the Iranian people do not want a Syria-type situation where it is an all-out war between the RGC and the people. I just don't see an appetite to go down that road. As I said in a previous answer, I do not yet see cracks in the security forces in any of these protests. And I would say, the regime has evolved a little bit. We talk about the crackdown, and yes, they shot people, they killed people, but they also, in the recent protests, combined it with a little bit of humility. And Khamenei got out there and said, I acknowledge there's problems, there's grievances. Rouhani has done that. I did not see that in some of the earlier responses, like in the Green Uprising of 2009. I did see some leadership statements saying you have a right to protest as long as you're peaceful, as long as you don't use violence, as long as you don't burn buildings, you can protest. So I'm seeing a little bit of evolution in how the regime plays these protest movements lately.
So
can I just make one sentence?
Yeah.
I think actually the biggest existential threat to the system is this culture of mendacity and incompetence that you see it all over. I mean, from shooting down the passenger jet to how they're dealing with the coronavirus and so on and so forth. And the only way they can resolve this is actually to open up the system, but they're closing it down. And so in some ways, they're actually dooming the system down the road. They might survive in the short run, but in the medium to long term, they're basically dooming the system to failure.
Jane mentioned cyber, and I just wanted to add one thought. I think one of the great untold stories is what the U.S. is doing to counter Iran in cyber. And I think that's happened multiple times at strategic moments when it looks like we're not responding kinetically and we're using cyber instead. And I think that will be increasingly the story because we actually have the capability to take down Iran completely, everything. And we don't want to do that in part because we don't want to set the precedent and then because the U.S. is the most vulnerable of any country on earth to cyber attack. And we don't want to encourage anyone else to adopt that kind of precedent. Anyway, so I'm going to take two questions because we only have a few minutes left. So, Hale, did you want to ask? And then a question here.
Ali, in Munich at the conference, there was a delegation from Iran. And we heard that Foreign Minister Zarif met with some senators. What was their sense? What was the sense of Zarif and the Iranian delegation of where they are going to move from now? And also, did you get a chance to bring up the fate of Siamak and the dual nationals in jail?
And here? We'll have a second question here, please.
Sorry, thank you. Yes, I was wondering, given given the remarks made, whether anything can be said about Iran's relationship in light of the elections with with the Russian elements and the Chinese elements. And the second component of that question is whether a counterbalance can be created between a significant expatriate Iranian community, 10% of the population lives outside of Iran, and the younger generation, about 8 to 10 million live outside of Iran, and a younger generation that is entirely dissatisfied with where the country is going. Thank you.
Okay, so we can't do all three answering that. So who wants to take that?
Which one?
I'll do the first question.
Either
and I
one.
think-
Sure, I can try the
Okay.
second. Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay, in terms of, let's start with the expats question. I think expats the diaspora plays an important role in ensuring communication and ensuring the flow of information in a period where, as we've said, the regime increasingly tries to stop the flow of information, right? Media outlets that are Persian language media outlets that are based abroad are particularly helpful in making sure that there is that flow of information. What I would caution against, though, is something that the administration seems to be wanting to do, which is to see the diaspora as a representation of what Iranians or the Iranian public may want. And there, I think the diaspora is fairly limited. It is a self-selecting group, by and large. Yes, there is back and forth. Yes, there's connections. Yes, there are family ties. But Secretary Pompeo going and talking to people in Austin, for example, or in San Diego, does not give him a sense of what Iranians may be thinking. And I think that we need to be honest and realistic about those limitations.
Ali's going to take the first question.
So, two observations of the views from Tehran at the Munich Security Conference. One is that they believe that the Trump administration is so confident with maximum pressure and believes that maximum pressure is working that basically there's no hope for any serious engagement through mediation or direct or in whatever format with the Trump administration. So the Iranians are now in a de facto less for less kind of arrangement with the Europeans when it gets to the JCPOA, and they believe it's a stable situation until November. That Iran is obviously not getting the benefits of the deal, but is also not abiding by its commitments by the restrictions of the JCPOA. But that I don't think means that they want to ramp up their nuclear capability much more. So the next deadline, 60-day deadline, which is March 6th, I don't think much is going to happen. And I think they want to hold this pattern until November. Now, the question is if the Europeans, and especially here I worry about the Brits, if they snap back the UN sanctions, which the arms embargo, the UN arms embargo is supposed to come off in October, and if the Brits decide, as a favor to the Trump administration, who's obsessed with this question, to stop that from being lifted by snapping back the UN sanctions, then I think all bets are off, and the Iranians would react in a very radical way, including by potentially withdrawing from the NPT.
Very briefly, Ken's
On the regional side, I think I agree with Ken, and my impression from discussions I had in Munich was that we'll see the continuation of pushback, probably in the form of indirect through proxies, with plausible deniability in places like Afghanistan, actually, that if this deal with the Taliban falls apart, I fear that would be the main theater of rivalry between the two countries. And finally, on the question of the prisoners, yes, I brought it up. Apparently, there are still discussions happening, despite all of the negative developments that we've seen. But I'm not holding my breath that anything will happen before the elections.
Ken wants to weigh in quickly, and then we'll do one more question.
Russia and China was mentioned. So each year, actually, Congress mandates that the administration do a report on Iran's military power. The latest report says that Iran has been in discussions and is seeking, and they list specific weapons systems that Iran wants to buy from Russia and China when the Resolution 2231 arms transfer embargo expires on October 18th of this year. So obviously the cooperation of those two countries in particular to extend the arms embargo obviously can't be counted on. In terms of snapback, I still don't see from the Europeans an appetite to snap back sanctions and basically kill the entire JCPOA. I don't see that right now.
Punit has one last question.
That was a really rich presentation. I just wanted to ask, to what degree do you think this conservative consolidation can be attributed to the maximum pressure policy? Do you see any prospect for Iran engaging with the Trump administration if there's a second term? And do you see them actually making any sort of compromises on regional activities and going further than the JCPOA?
And to add the yin to Punit's yang, if the JCPOA had endured or was still supported by the United States, might that have led to a different electoral outcome, or were we headed in this direction anyway? So.
Sure. I mean, really, really hard to say whether, had the JCPOA continued, if we would have seen a different outcome. The Guardian Council may have disqualified half the candidates still, and we would have still ended up with the same results, right? I do think the maximum pressure campaign and everything that has been unfolding internationally and regionally for Iran plays a role. But I think that the domestic is actually probably the bigger piece here. In terms of whether or not Iran may engage the United States should President Trump win a second term, I think that is plausible. But I think that it's dependent on a few things. One is whether or not the administration manages to send a coherent message to Iran. Two is whether it manages to establish off-ramps and not see off-ramps as sort of taking out the maximum from maximum pressure, which it seems to be doing currently. And in terms of the regional, I think, the regional and the missiles were always something that could be added to the JCPOA. They were not going to be negotiated within the context of the JCPOA. But currently, the Iranians are engaging on the regional files with the Europeans, right? That Yemen is a topic of conversation between the two sides. So that means that it's not completely off the table. It just means that we have to find the right platform, the right format for those negotiations, and the administration needs to be offering a more coherent message as to what it's willing to do to get what it wants, and also what it is that it's looking to achieve, right, which we don't have very good answers to right now.
And I have a feeling that the administration is deeply divided in actually what it wants to do. Final thought from both Ali and Ken?
So I think the conservative consolidation is multifactorial. It's not just because of the Trump administration, but I think it's also a mistake to overlook how much they did in discrediting the conservatives' rivals. In fact, in every election since 2012, despite disqualification, the conservatives had lost, right? Last year, disqualification rate was 45% versus 56% this year. So we're not talking about a major change in terms of disqualification, but we talk about the major change in the political fortunes, which I think was partly because of the Trump administration, which turned out to be the best ally that the Iranian hardliners could wish for. But I also have to admit that the Rouhani administration overpromised, underdelivered, mismanaged, lied, covered up. I mean, all sorts of mistakes that they committed is also, I think, and their PR strategy has been disastrous internally. So there's also, they have themselves to blame for that. On the prospects for negotiations, look, I think if there is a second Trump term, the Iranians say, and including discussions I had just last week, they say we will wait it out for another 5 years. I don't think that's possible. So if there is a second Trump term, the economic situation in Iran would not allow the system to keep its head above the water for that long. And so they will have to negotiate. The question is, and as you well know, Puneet, the Iranians don't come to the negotiating table from a position of weakness. So they want to revive their leverage. And that's what I'm afraid of, which means that we probably have to go through a nuclear crisis or maybe through more regional crises before we get back to a negotiating table. And with this administration, even if it's in its second term, that's a dangerous proposition. And finally, on JCPOA+, yes, I think it's possible. In fact, the Iranians can make concessions on the ballistic missile issue, on the regional issue, but only if we're talking about marginal concessions, and only if the reciprocation on this side goes beyond economic incentives and has some security assurances also put on the table. But a grand bargain, I don't think is possible in the foreseeable future or as long as the Supreme Leader is in office.
And finally, Ken.
Yeah, I think the answer to the question, Puneet, lies with administration policymakers, because I think what it comes down to is the administration willing to ease sanctions or not? And I'm looking for signs, but to be honest, I do not right now see indications that the administration is willing to entertain the idea of easing sanctions. I mean, there are new sanctions announced virtually every week. It's a succession, and now they've begun designating high-level Iranian officials for sanctions, which never was the case before till recently. So I just, until I have an answer to that question, it's very hard to say. Yes, Iran has indicated they're willing to talk about long-range missiles, which, as I said in a previous answer, is not core to their national security strategy anyway. It's the short-range missiles that are. On whether they're willing to bargain voluntary restraints in their efforts to support regional armed factions, I personally would give that a flat no. I see no indications that they will accept any restraints on supporting these factions that they see as key to their ability to project power in the region.
Please join me in thanking my wonderful panel, Ali, Ariane, and Ken, for just an amazing session. And thank you all for coming.
Hi, I briefed you on Iran a few years ago in your office.
Smarter, but it takes a long time with an analog brain.
Thank you for your kind words. You're just wonderful.
Yeah.
One of my lines as Secretary of State was, I would.
And I'll tell you why. When you see a quantum leap in technology,
Watch Fox and Friends.
you don't see